Hello and welcome to this March-April topic analysis for Lincoln-Douglas debate, which is about resolved, the primary objective of the United States criminal justice system ought to be rehabilitation. So first, let's start off with the definitions. The United States, again, obviously is the United States federal government that can be divided up into their three branches, but most specifically it just refers to the United States as a collective whole. The second word is the primary objective, and this refers to the most important step that the United States government ought to do or they should prioritize in the first place, which sets up the next couple of definitions. The criminal justice system is the system of law enforcement that engages in apprehending, prosecuting, defending, sentencing, and punishing. So there are a bunch of different steps that the criminal justice system has to engage in, but it's a question of what priorities that the United States government should do in the world of the affirmative versus the world of the negative, which is open for debate. And the last definition is rehabilitation, in which it's defined as the care that helps people regain, maintain, or improve abilities needed for daily life. That can look like employment opportunities, education programs like GEDs, or possibly other types of mental health or drug rehabilitation programs that help people to sort of transition into society and sort of a project of re-entry that enables them to get more access to resources in the long term. So let's talk about the ground on this topic. The first sort of intuitive ground is the notion of public health. And this is where recidivism comes in. So recidivism is defined as the likelihood of someone that has been already convicted of a crime after they're released from jail, the likelihood that within 3 months they are going to get reincarcerated into jail again. And many people would argue that recidivism is a question of what people choose to do after they get released from prison. But the majority of the times, people commit a crime or they recidivate, in other words, because they are forced to. Because once you are incarcerated and you get released from jail, you're not given any employment opportunities and you're just left to the streets to sort of starve and possibly even die of starvation. So what ends up happening is that people turn to drugs as an alternative, or some people commit minor crimes like theft or possibly even other types of extortion, like trying to get money as quickly as possible. And the sort of first intuitive ground is obviously public health. Because if rehabilitation decreases recidivism, there's a lot of statistics on why that is true. If that happens, that means that the likelihood of people getting arrested and placed back into jail decreases because now there's less people that are incarcerated in the first place. And so that would prevent overcrowding in the prisons in the long term because there's less people that are arrested. The second argument on the is the notion about broader recidivism, or in this case, mass incarceration. So there's a lot of arguments on the affirmative that talk about how currently the United States criminal justice system focuses on mass incarceration or punitive measures that try to sort of convict people of minor crimes as much as possible. So just like to throw people into prison and just like see what happens. But the affirmative is advocating for the complete opposite. We're arguing that that sort of model of mass incarceration is bad. And so it's saying that our priority shouldn't be punitive measures, but it should rather be rehabilitative ones. And so the argument is that rehabilitation enables people to live better lives and escape their cycle of poverty and imprisonment. But this affirmative would be able to combat that by preventing mass incarceration, enabling people to transition into society, and turning the objective of the criminal justice system not into one that punishes people, but rather helps people, works with them, and grants better relationships between the correctional officers and the prison members themselves. That improves the quality of life and the quality of these prisons themselves. Just to review, recidivism concerns talks about how the repeated cycle of recidivism is intergenerational. So if a parent is incarcerated, then the entire family's lives turn into turmoil because they fall into poverty, with no parent able to become the breadwinner. So the children under that situation of poverty is unable to get education, for example. And so when the children grow up without education, they are unable to get jobs, and thus they are more likely to get incarcerated because they have to resort to minor crimes like stealing food in order for them to survive. They have to sort of, in some cases, unfortunately, they commit drugs or do drugs because they have no other coping mechanism. And because many different criminal justice officers believe that doing drugs is a criminal offense, they arrest them for that. And so, although it's not necessarily their choice to do drugs, it's rather they're forced into that condition, which is another thing that the affirmative can claim and talk about how the current cycles of suffering is not things that these people choose to do It's rather unfortunate conditions that are forced upon them. It's a byproduct of our current criminal justice system, which is obviously bad. So on the flip side, let's talk about negative ground. So the first contention that I can think of is talking about ineffectiveness. And so one example is that Norway has a very big rehabilitative system, and some can argue that Norway prioritizes rehabilitation over all else. And they have really good services, but the problem is that a lot of their services are very costly. I think there's this one statistic that says that for each prisoner, they spend around $90,000. And that might be good for Norway because they spend a lot of money on those prisons. But in the United States, because there's so many different people, considering that there's 1 million people that are incarcerated, spending $90,000 on each person is going to be really unsustainable for the government. And so this contention is sort of arguing that if it's logistically impossible for the US to prioritize rehabilitation, it shouldn't be their primary objective. It shouldn't be their main goal if they can't even practically do it in the first place. So the affirmative's arguments are going to be rooted in things like, oh, if you prove that rehabilitation is a good general principle, we should win the round. But as the negative, it's your burden to prove why, oh, sure, it might be good in a vacuum, but if you actually look at the practicalities of it, it's not going to be feasible. It's not going to be possible. Now, the second negative contention that is also pretty intuitive to understand and probably one of the stock contentions is talking about subjectivity. It talks about how rehabilitation is riddled with biases that dominate sentencing and opening up the potential for abuse. And so the issue is that a lot of the people that sentence people into prison, they are always riddled with biases. And so if you switch that sort of notion of punitive measures to rehabilitative ones, that means that certain people are always going to get favored by the criminal justice system to either get rehabilitative services. So let's say, for example, there is a certain racial group that a judge is more inclined towards. And let's say that that criminal is a violent criminal. Let's say, for example, if racial biases mean that that person gets more rehabilitative services. Obviously, that's bad because they're a violent criminal. And also, like, if there's something wrong in terms of your cognitions or your mental health that cannot be solved or treated with rehabilitation, the government's just going to say, oh, you got rehabilitated, you can just re-enter society. But in reality, rehabilitation shortens the sort of prison sentences of people because you're not spending your time in solitary confinement. You're spending your time training yourself and getting education programs. So in reality, that would sort of lessen the punitiveness of prison punishments that makes certain people, like violent criminals, less inclined to be deterred by the criminal justice system. So thank you for watching this video. I heard you learned a lot about the March-April topic analysis for LD, and good luck in your debates.